Welcome back to the Daily Poem here on the Close Reads Podcast Network. I'm David Kearney. Today's poem is by an American poet named Jones Very. I am not particularly familiar with Jones Very, but what I did was when I was trying to figure out what poem to read for today, I just on a whim picked up the book that Harold Bloom edited, the anthology that Harold Bloom edited called The Best Poems of the English Language. Bloom, of course, died last week, and so I thought, I'll do a few poems this week from his anthology. And I opened it up at random, and it opened up to a poem called New Birth from Jones Very. So I'll go ahead and read this poem, and then I'll offer some thoughts as usual, and then I'll read it again. Jones Very was an American poet who lived from 1813 to 1880. He was a poet, essayist, he was a clergyman. He is sometimes associated with transcendentalism, and he was also known as a scholar of Shakespeare. And so many of the poems, including the one that I'm going to read today, is formally a Shakespearean sonnet. So here is New Birth by Jones Very. 'Tis a new life. Thoughts move not as they did with slow, uncertain steps across my mind. In thronging haste, fast pressing on, they bid the portals open to the viewless wind. That comes not save when in the dust is laid the crown of pride that gilds each mortal brow, and from before man's vision melting fade the heavens and earth. Their walls are falling now. Fast crowding on, each thought claims utterance strong. Storm-lifted waves, swift rushing to the shore, on from the sea they send their shouts along. Back through the cave-worn rocks their thunders roar. And I, child of God by Christ made free, start from death's slumbers to eternity. So, in this anthology, Harold Bloom includes little biographical descriptions or notes about the poets. And he notes that Jones Very was teaching Greek at Harvard to potential or future ministers. And while doing this, he apparently had an intense mystical experience. This is in 1837. And after that mystical experience, he wrote a bunch of really good poets. It was such an intense experience that people took him to be insane, and they put him into an insane asylum, McLean Asylum, for a month. And then after that, around 1840, he stopped writing poetry. So it seems like during this period when people thought he was crazy, he had some kind of mystical experience. Most of his best poetry was written. He apparently after that abandoned transcendentalism and things like that. So there's a really interesting, thing going on there with his life. Bloom says that he probably is the best, during that period, he probably was the best devotional poet that America has ever had. This is an interesting poem because of some of the things that he does structurally. Bloom points out in his notes that the pace of the poem really picks up as you go. But one of the things that I was realizing while I was reading this poem, which I don't know if I've ever read before, is the way the alliteration and the assonance in the first few lines slows you down so much before it picks up really quickly with all the enjambment or all the lines that blend together later in the poem. So in the second line we get, let's start with the first line. He says, "'Tis a new life." There's a dash there. Then, "Thoughts move, not as they did, with slow, uncertain steps across my mind. In thronging haste, fast pressing on, they bid the portals open to the viewless wind." So those are the first four lines. And that line 2, "with slow, uncertain steps across my mind." It's a great line because it's talking about the idea of slow, uncertain steps, but the phrasing of that makes you slow down. So just when you think it's going to pick up because of the enjambment after line 1, where line 1 just runs into line 2, it slows you down. So your brain says, let's go. But then especially if you're reading it out loud, you have to slow down. I had to read it a few times to get that out. Slow, uncertain steps across my mind. There's nothing like the S sound to slow you down when you're reading out loud. But then as the poem goes, the pace really picks up. Let's see if I can find a good spot for that. So the portals open to the viewless wind. That comes not, save when in the dust is laid the crown of pride that gilds each mortal brow, and from before man's vision, melting fade the heavens and earth. Their walls are falling now. Fast crowding on each thought claims utterance strong. So here we got a line, fast crowding on each thought claims utterance strong. And that's a line you have to be careful with, but it's also a line that allows you to pick up the pace a little bit. So he's playing with what's the word? Urgency, I think is a good word there. He's playing with urgency, even in the way that you have to read it. So there's this theme there. There's this theme of maybe even reflecting on his own mystical experience, his own spiritual life, building to ultimately, sort of the denouement, the end, if you want to use that term, or the resolution, where in the final lines, the final couplet at the end, I, a child of God by Christ made free, start from death's slumbers to eternity. So it builds to that climactic moment, but he builds to that in fits and starts, getting you as the reader to slow down and speed up. And that's what makes it, I think, sort of contemplative. So it's very interesting. So here is one more time, The New Birth by Jones Very. 'Tis a new life. Thoughts move not as they did with slow, uncertain steps across my mind, in thronging haste, fast pressing on as they bid the portals open to the viewless wind that comes not, save when in the dust is laid the crown of pride that gilds each mortal brow, and from before man's vision melting fade the heavens and earth. Their walls are falling now. Fast crowding on each thought claims utterance strong, storm-lifted waves swift rushing to the shore. On from the sea they send their shouts along. Back through the cave-worn rocks their thunders roar. And I, a child of God by Christ made free, start from death's slumbers to eternity. This has been the Daily Poem. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with another poem.